Mr. White, you were ambassador in El Salvador in what year?
1980 and 1981, but realized that that was my, I'd served in Honduras for 3 years and Nicaragua for 2 years prior to going to El Salvador.
I'd like to talk about what has been described as the powerful and arbitrary nature of the camera. We're talking about communication here, about reporting wars and political strife around the world. The effect that that camera, its presence, along with the rest of the press, has upon the kind of work that and responsibilities that you face down there. Did it affect you in any way?
Well, I think that this war in El Salvador has got very little to do with guns and military training, and a great deal to do with the moral authority that one side or the other can bring to its cause. And I think to the extent that the reporters, either television or press reporters, can reflect the more profound aspects of the struggle, then it certainly has an important role.
Well, El Salvador, or Central America, is pretty well removed from the life of the average American. I mean, to communicate what it's like down there, what life is like, what the hostilities such as they are, or the political intrigue such as it is a thing that's exceedingly difficult to do. But it would seem to me that there is more press and more attention by the press on that situation down there than there was in the past. Do you think can you see that it has affected in any way what has happened down there?
Oh, there's no question that it has affected things. Governments such as exist today in Guatemala and El Salvador can only flourish when the eyes of the world are averted. The constant killing, the constant abuses against human rights. These governments are finished in large part because the press has focused world attention on them. This type of killer government that you have in Guatemala today, or the military in El Salvador, and to a certain extent, unfortunately, in Honduras, these groups are finished. It's just a matter of time before they leave the scene. The really unfortunate thing, of course, is the United States government is trying to stop their disappearance and looks upon them, this type of government, as an advantage. But certainly the focus of the camera, the focus of the print journalists on El Salvador and on the abuses has had a tremendous effect.
The unfortunate death of the ABC correspondent Bill Stewart in Nicaragua, what year was that? 1980, was it?
79.
79. What effect do you think that had upon the Somoza government?
Well, I think the beginning of the end for Somoza was the killing of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, a Nicaraguan journalist and perhaps the most admired man in Nicaragua. And I think that Somoza's doom was definitively sealed when the world saw the tragic death, unnecessary death of Bill Stewart at the hands of the National Guard in Nicaragua.
The fact that the camera was there and recorded it, though, the fact that that was communicated to the public.
Oh, it had just a tremendous impact. I mean, you can multiply those instances. The photographs of the Salvadoran military machine gunning the people on the steps of the cathedral in the same year. The death of the American church women and the pictures of them being pulled from the graves. I think that all these things brought home to the American people the bestiality of the groups that we were supporting and are supporting, unfortunately, in Central America.
Many of us recall that picture of you standing at the grave of the American church women. And that impact here was, as you say, very, 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 very strong. What can you tell us about the press and how the press covered that story, as you recall it, from your viewpoint down there?
But you know, I think when you're following common sense policies and trying to do the right thing, things that are in line with the American values and traditions, that you don't have any great problem with the press. I never had an argument with the press while I was there, either about secrecy or about their figures on death tolls being different from our figures. We were both reporting essentially the same thing because one thing I always refused to do was hide the facts. The facts are what they are. The policies you follow are something else. Now we're into a policy that I think being carried out by the Reagan administration that I personally believe violates the values of the American people. And I think for this reason you're now seeing a conflict between the people who are trying to report the news and people who are trying to carry out a policy who don't want to know the facts because the facts get in the way of this policy.
Well, we always talk, or we talk a lot about the adversary relationship that exists, reportedly, supposedly exists between the press and government, military, administrative people, whoever they may be. You say it did not exist when you were there. You feel it's growing now, though.
Oh, I think that unquestionably it's going to grow any time that the press perceives that it is being lied to, that officials are covering up for, quote, our side, unquote.
What about the power of the press to affect policy, to affect State Department policy, for example? Do you think that in time there will be a change down there because the bright light is upon the situation?
Well, the policy that the Reagan administration is following in El Salvador and in Central America will fail because they're leaning on broken reeds. There's no way that all the military training and all the military hardware in the world can put morale and inspire good performance by troops when they're led by men whom they don't respect, men who routinely use torture and assassination of innocent people as a weapon. So the idea that we can somehow make up for these shortcomings is what will ultimately defeat our policy. Now, to the extent that the media focuses on that and brings this home to the American people, it will certainly undermine our policy and have an effect, I hope, of permitting us or encouraging the Reagan administration to reassess.
The word undermine has a negative value right there, but I'm sure that you mean that it will have a positive effect as it presents a truth.
Well, yes, but I regard the policy as fatally flawed, and therefore I think that undermining is a good thing. I mean, it's still, whether it's good or bad, what it's doing is it's taking away the props of this policy, and properly so, because they are false props.
One wonders what effect that Newsweek story here a while back about American plans in Central America, what impact it had on the American people. One wonders how those involved in carrying out those plans reacted. Is secrecy in our operations down there really necessary?
Well, there is a need for secrecy when you are dealing with someone else and you don't want to know it publicized each time you adjust your position. But that's really the only requirement for secrecy. If you are following intelligent policies that have the backing of your people and make sense to them, then secrecy is not really important in foreign policy. It may be important in dealing with the Soviet Union. I can see that there can be some occasions where that is truly important. When you are dealing with an open society, when you are working out U.S. attitudes and postures towards small neighbors, it seems to me that the only way your policies are going to succeed is if you can explain them on a regular basis to the American people. I think it's very instructive to note that we now have a policy in Central America that's dividing the American people And neither the President of the United States, nor the Secretary of State, nor any other responsible high-level official has ever given a speech on Central America and explaining our policy. Now, that's in my view because nobody wants the job. But I think that the Reagan administration is not fulfilling its responsibilities to the American people, and it seems to me that the press is filling that gap.
As ambassador, did you ever have a clearly stated objective
Certainly did.
enunciated by Washington?
Absolutely. There was a great difference between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. I'm no uncritical admirer of Jimmy Carter, but I'll tell you the foreign policy in Latin America was first class. And the policy, you could sum up this way. Convince the people of Central America, in my case, the people of El Salvador, that they don't have to turn to the Soviet Union and Cuba for understanding of the need for change, that we'll support change. And that is what we did in El Salvador and in Nicaragua and in other places. Now, the Reagan administration has set its face against change and allied with those toadies of the past, and the result is going to be disaster.
We like to think of ourselves as the, quote, the good guys. Why do you think that we are apparently losing the ideological struggle in Central America?
I think that we have forgotten what we are all about. I think that, we are a country that was born in revolution, and yet, by the lights of the people who are now leading us, all revolutions are born in Moscow and Havana, and that's just mindless. It's not so. It's brutality, hunger, injustice that bring revolutions into being, and that's what's happening in Central America. And until you recognize it as a fact, you're never going to be able to cope with revolution. And the future belongs to the government, the country that understands revolution and evolves an elegant and sophisticated and even subtle policy to deal with it. This does not mean that all revolutionaries should be welcomed and hailed as deliverers. No, but unless you understand the motivation for revolution and how they think and why they went into this life or death struggle, then you're going to lose.
If what you say is true, do you feel that the press has communicated that to the American people?
No, I have to tell you that I don't think the press has been too profound on issues like this. Let's take an example of the elections in El Salvador some months ago. The press reported the elections as a bona fide exercise in democracy. Only Ray Bonner of the New York Times, and he's since been fired, did a good job of examining what was wrong with the electoral process. Let me point out to you that elections have been used by every dictator in Central America to maintain himself in power. The last thing those of us who believe in democracy wanted to see was another flawed election that simply discredited the democracy in Central America. Can the United States or the Reagan administration point to any change in the life of the people of El Salvador as a result of those elections? The only result was that Napoleon Duarte and the Christian Democratic Party lost power, and the extreme right gained power. And why? Simply because we refused to help establish the conditions by which the left could participate in those elections. Had we done that, had we not been in such a hurry, we could have helped El Salvador bring about an election that would in all probability have resulted in a moderate left center coalition that would have had a great chance of leading El Salvador out of this quagmire.
You mentioned that Bonner of the New York Times was now fired. Do you think he was fired because of the content of his story?
Well, I think that there were a variety of reasons. I think Ray made a couple of errors, but I think all in all, his reporting, along with Alan Ridings and Beth Nissens and a few of the others, was excellent, just first class. There was some great reporting out of El Salvador. Unfortunately, Alan can't go back to El Salvador because the right has threatened to kill him if he goes back.
Do you think that the press might be charged with being capricious about stories? El Salvador, for example, is on the front page for a while, and then suddenly it goes down in the corner and goes to page 3.
Well, I don't understand the motivations of those who put in, place stories. I mean, I think just accept it as a fact of life. I think that the real criticism, in a sense, and it's not fair, is of television, which because of the paraphernalia that you have to carry around has to wait till a story breaks until they get down there, and then they almost have to set up the whole scene. So I think that there are grave limitations on television. I think that the real problem, though, has been that there have not been sufficient probing. There hasn't been sufficient incisive uncovering of what's underneath, why are we doing these things, and what the motivation of various people are. For example, the press has yet to point out in any effective way that the Reagan policy is 100% different from the Carter policy. The Carter policy encouraged negotiations between the revolutionary left and the government. And the government of El Salvador, under Duarte, was seeking those negotiations. Now, the Reagan administration rejects negotiations and has placed our policy in pawn to the hardline military of El Salvador. What this means is simply that we have done what we did in Vietnam, give over our policy, we put it in the hands of a tough military who cannot compromise, because if they compromise, the minimum thing they will lose are their heads.